I don't denigrate flavor. And in many senses, for me, it's the most important element. But our appreciation of flavor changes in the way our appreciation of music changes, or literature, or film, or whatever we happen to be into. And, I laugh about Starbucks because it's shit, but, it can be a gateway to drinking coffee for some people. It's a pretty shitty gateway, but it could bring someone to an appreciation of better coffee. And I always hope people become more aware of what they consume, how it affects their body. I mean, how it affects their head. I'm obviously not a shining example of healthy living. I eat too much, I drink too much, I work too much. But I eat good things and I drink good things. And I don't wake up in the morning struggling, needing to take an aspirin or Disprin. Very lucky in the sense that the food I eat comes either from us or from people around us. We eat good vegetables, we eat good bread, we eat good meat. Flavor is a very important part of how we can approach an understanding of what's going on around us. In the same way, I don't regard fashion as a dirty word. I mean, it was very funny, a journalist said I was a source of infection for this horrible fashion of orange muscat wine, macerated muscat. And, I was like, fuck you, because you're a dick. But, I said, have you heard of this thing called climate change? Orange wine is not just about a fashion. As the 18th century dandy, I think, dress in fashion to show that I'm aware of the times in which I live. And, I always think that's a brilliant statement. I obviously don't particularly dress in fashion, but my wine, for better or worse, is fashionable in a certain context. Very not so in others. And that particular point of orange wine as a fashion sort of gives it a temporary kind of, but it's also an acknowledgement that we're living in a period where the summers are drier, hotter, overall rainfall is a lot less, so our fermentations are far more complicated because rain is a super important part of growing things. To ferment a wine naturally is tied to your rainfall. It's tied to your, I should say, moisture levels in your soil. And, orange wine, by fermenting with the grapes and skins and stems, because there's no excuse to destem an orange wine ever, in my opinion, is tied into an acknowledgement of the climate has changed. It will continue to change, but it has changed. If I came to the Roussillon in 1999, the average rainfall was 550, 600 millimeters. Today, it's 300. It's cut in two. We've had 4 vintages of 200, which is 300 is technically desert. We can't keep expecting to be able to make easily fermentable, direct pressed wines, whether it's rosé or white wine. It just does not work like that. And I don't want to use diammonium phosphate or other fermentation aids. This sort of protein source, nitrogen it changes the flavor profiles, it interferes. It's not good for you. Yes, you can make white wine. In my area, you need to look at very specific areas, altitudes where the rainfall is more significant. But right where I'm situated, it has become extremely difficult to consider doing direct pressed white wine at less than, say, 500 millimeters per year. In the time I've been in the Roussillon, we've had 2004, 2014, and 2020 with 600 to 700 millimeters. And 2008, when I made my first orange wine, the Alexandria, we got 230 millimeters. It's a beautiful vintage, and we had a lot of leftover water as such from the 2007 vintage and snow that year as well. The vineyards actually performed very well, but the stress came actually in 2009. But already I was starting to notice changes, and the idea essentially came on the spur of the moment because Muscat d'Alexandrie is a terrible grape to press. What makes it such a delicious eating grape is this pulp, this firm pulp that contains the juice, but they're actually very hard to separate without the use of enzymes in modern winemaking terms. But those enzymes are naturally created during the fermentation in whole bunch. And plus with the stems, that pulp contains a lot of proteins which lead to instability, including reduction, smelly kind of off cabbagey aromas. But the stems have a negative electronic charge. The proteins have a positive electronic charge, and the stems fine out a lot of the heavy proteins. So there's a very natural movement towards balance, equilibrium, that is done by going back to essentially traditional winemaking techniques that also help us deal with a changing present, a changing future, or a future filled with change and this variation. So, I'm faced with the fact that I've had 3 vintages out of 20 odd that were actually suited to making white wine. So if I was to make white wine in those vintages, that would be a fad. That would be an appeal to some kind of more acceptable social more. The choice to move increasingly towards orange wine, as I've done over the last 18 years, 17 years, it's actually got very little to do with fashion. And certainly when I was turning up with macerated muscat in 2009 or 10, 11, 12, people didn't really know what to make of it, and there wasn't a market for it. That had to develop, and it did very quickly. And then by 2015, people were saying, "Oh, but this is wrong. It's a fashion," as if wine is somehow tied to this timeless hierarchy of these wonderful terroir that we put Romanée-Conti right at the top, and right at the bottom you have us in the Roussillon. I don't think nature works like this. And our job at base is to react to the circumstances of the natural world around us at our time. Only a moron, obviously there's quite a few of those, would deny climate change at this point. I don't think it has to be miserable. When I see people getting angry and upset about having to drink orange wine, my basic reaction is always fuck off, because it's just my favorite phrase, the inarticulacy of rage. But no, my palate's changed. And I remember my first orange wines I started drinking about 20 years ago, maybe a little longer. And I didn't know what to make of it. It's funny, meeting the Georgians already 15, 16 years ago, and for them it was something completely natural and normal. I find it sad that people think I'm trying to attack tradition in France. Well, I'm not. I'm trying to make the best of what I have at this given moment. And purely on a taste, if I can go back to the flavor subject, Muscat, as an example, it has so much fruit and flower, and a whole bunch maceration kind of brings up your mineral and vegetal characteristics that create a more balanced wine that works better at table. When Escoffier talks about muscat, dry muscat, having a place at table with green vegetables, asparagus, artichoke, fresh olive oil, all these green flavored things that traditionally cause misery for direct pressed white Burgundy, for example. They bring out a very metallic bitterness. Muscat had that place in the traditional French table. Well over 100 years ago, this was noted. And I don't see why we can't rediscover. When I see kind of laughable food and wine matchings where people put direct pressed Sauvignon Blanc with asparagus, and it just tastes like you're crunching an empty tin can in your mouth, I weep. And I think fine dining, definitely in France, has really missed out on a huge opportunity to explore not just the future, but the past as well, by clinging to a very fragile, artificial present, conception of what great wine is. I don't see sticking to a very boring winemaking regime of direct press, if we're talking white wine or rosé, direct press, adding some tartric acid, adding some sulfur, adding some yeast, doing a cold stabilization, doing fining, doing a filtration at bottling. You know, I'd rather just drink fucking beer. Something that's gone through all of this. It may even come from organic or biodynamic grapes, but it's still a boring piece of crap to my palate. And I realize I have a particular palate. I'm not going to apologize for it. You know, that's the result of well over 30 years of drinking all kinds of wine. And, you know, I realized I found far more encouragement for my palate drinking old wines. This was when, you know, I was starting to drink a lot of wine in the late 80s, early 90s. I was working in wine shops at university. I was working in wineries when I was out and about. And I realized that the wines that appealed the most to me were coming from far away in time. But what also became clear to me was that the modern wines being produced by a lot of these classic wineries were no longer the same. You know, they will never age like that. And maybe they shouldn't, but, you know, if you take a classical winery in Bandol, for example, producing Mourvèdre, that 30 years ago was 12 alcohol and delicious and aged well with good natural acidity, a low pH, a sense of life, freshness, fruit, which I find very important to a wine. Now take that same wine, it's weighing 14.5, 15 alcohol, the acidity's gone, or it's added tartric acidity, refined tartric, disgusting. One of the worst things you can do to your human palate is put refined tartric acid on it. Not to mention the stomach, which is also super sensitive to such things. I think this obsession with even naive belief that a lot of these classical wineries are producing the same wine they made 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago, it's ridiculous. And, you know, the fashion for me was someone like Parker pronouncing that we need ultra ripeness to be serious, that confusing high sugar with flavor. You know, sugar is coming from the sun. Yes, it's an important part of wine, but it's not the most important part. Flavor comes from the soil. And that's kind of where I regard my main work, is getting life back in the soil. And those yeast and bacteria that are the basis of life with the organic matter attaching to the clay particle, holding it, holding the water in, keeping the moisture. That's where flavor comes from. And so our appreciation of good flavor is also an appreciation of healthy land in good heart, as Sir Albert Howard said. Voila.